Okay, we're going to investigate a little more about what's called the Northern Renaissance. That is the kind of continuation of Renaissance ideals north of the Alps, so outside of Italy. And then we're also going to look at the role of politics in three of the big European powers during the Renaissance, and that is England, France, and Spain. So we're going to start with looking at the Renaissance in the north and then move on to politics. So the big thing to know about the Northern Renaissance is this concept called Christian humanism. So it is essentially humanism, but rather than really focusing on Greek and Roman texts for inspiration, these Northern or Christian humanists, you'll see those terms used interchangeably, look back to early Christian writers. So still looking back to the quote ancients, but instead of them being pagan, Greek, and Romans, they specifically look for Christians. And that is a way for them to maintain kind of that humanist element of looking to the past, but also really emphasizing their religion. And part of this is that just understanding the geography and history of Europe is that Christianity, Catholicism particularly, was so strong in Italy. That's the seat of the Pope. That is where all of the power lays. And up in the north, and we're talking kind of the Low Countries in Germany and those sorts of areas, still very much Christian and Catholic, but not as connected to their church because they're not seeing the cardinals and the popes and these people of power. So a little bit different, and really emphasizing the Christian nature rather than the pagan nature because of their kind of concern for their image. So with that said, these Christian humanists very much criticized the Catholic Church. They saw a lot of flaws within the Catholic Church, but they were themselves horrified when that criticism continued and, in their eyes, spiraled out of control, culminating in this Reformation by Martin Luther. They wanted to criticize and reform the church, but that didn't mean that they believed in what Luther did or what other Reformation leaders did. They thought that took it too far. Two of the most famous Christian humanists and people that you really should know are Erasmus and Sir Thomas More. And Erasmus writes a book called In Praise of Folly, which is kind of a scathing satire that really makes fun of the church. And he uses this humor to poke fun at the church and to make fun of the things that are going on at the time and what he perceives as being the failures of the church. Erasmus doesn't just make fun of the church, though. He calls for some reforms, and he asks for an emphasis on inner faith instead of outer worship. So he really wants to push inner belief and personal relationship with God over outer forms of worship, such as the sacraments or church rituals that he sees as being too overwhelming, too hyper-focused, and taking and almost in many ways detracting from real relationship with God. So he calls for reform. He actually even ends up corresponding with Martin Luther when Luther starts, but thinks that Luther's going too far, especially when Luther finally breaks from the church. He wants to reform the church, but not go nearly as far as Luther did. Sir Thomas More writes a famous book called Utopia, in which he criticizes modern society and says that the problem with all evil kind of people is a result of society, not a result of anything else. And so he blames society for the evils of the day, not human nature, not any of that stuff, but this institution known as society. And so he tries to depict a better one in this book, Utopia, and that's where we get the term utopia from. Okay, makes sense. He is very critical of the practices of the Catholic Church, really pushes for changes to be made, but with that said, he very much loves the Catholic Church and wants to remain a part of it. And so this becomes a problem when the English Reformation takes place, because Sir Thomas More is a knight. He is Sir. He works for the king in a real official royal capacity. He's one of his closest advisors. And when the king, King Henry VIII, sets up the Church of England, he makes everyone take an oath of loyalty to him that says that he is, in fact, the head of not just England, but the head of the church. Sir Thomas More refuses to acknowledge that, thus committing treason in the eyes of Henry VIII, and is eventually beheaded for that reason. So in the Northern Renaissance, there's a few other artists that are worth mentioning. Albert Dürer is famous for his portraits of wealthy nobles and merchants, as well as his religious paintings. He kind of specializes in those two things. It is an important shift from the previous art, which had not even included portraits. So this is a major shift. And then another person that's worth noting is Peter Bruegel, and he's sometimes known as Peter Bruegel the Elder. He paints landscapes and peasants. So what we start to see is this glimpse of everyday society and the rule and the lives of everyday people, and we see kind of this as being, viewing these people as being important to society. So he starts painting not just wealthy people, but everyday commoners. And so this is an important shift too, to show the lives of these peasants are meaningful. It also ends up being a useful historical tool for us. Then in England, there's something called the Elizabethan Renaissance, and it's under the rule of Elizabeth I, who we'll talk more about when we get to the English Renaissance, or the English Reformation. But under her Via Media, this middle way, there's peace, there's stability, and there's opportunity for English culture to grow. And the most famous result of this English Renaissance is William Shakespeare and his many plays, sonnets, and various things that still impact us to this day. So the Northern Renaissance has some important people and has some big names. It's not as kind of significant, if you will, as the Italian Renaissance. It's not as well known, but nonetheless it plays an important role in understanding European society in the 15th and then eventually 16th, 17th century. All right, now we're going to kind of dig into the politics in three major Renaissance European countries. So we're going to start in Spain. And Spain is kind of a conglomeration of a number of different kingdoms. You have Portugal and Navarre and Aragon and Castile and Catalonia and Granada. And eventually Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile end up marrying and kind of uniting those two kingdoms and kind of creating this unified Spain for the first time. We have this unified Spain, and they embark on what's known as the Reconquista, which is the reconquering, the retaking of Spain from the Moors, the Muslims, North African Muslims, who had taken it before in the 800s and had held on to it until this time. And so the banner year kind of for the Spanish monarchy and Spain as a whole is in 1492. And in 1492, the Reconquista is complete. The final city falls, that is Granada, is finally conquered. Jews and Muslims are both expelled in 1492 officially. They're not allowed to be in Spain anymore. The goal is to make a religiously pure nation. Everyone has to be Catholic. We'll get back to that in a second. And also that same year, Columbus sails off on his voyage across the Atlantic. So 1492 is really a banner year for Spain. One of the other things that Ferdinand and Isabella do is they really work to centralize the power of the monarchy and to establish a centralized nation and kind of, I don't know that we'll call it an absolute monarchy yet, but definitely building towards an absolute monarchy. And one of the ways they do this is they reauthorize what's known as the Hermandades, which is a local police force that kind of has free reign to do whatever they want because they have this writ from the crown that grants them control and power over a certain region for enforcing laws and carrying out the crown's will. So this is kind of an important moment, important groups of people in order to have this control. The king and queen, remember this is an era before telephones and before instant travel, they needed to have reliable people in various towns, and that's where the Hermandades come in. Another way that they try to unify and centralize Spain is again by having it all be one religion. They want it to be religiously pure, and it should not be a surprise that that religion is Catholicism. And so they create an institution. They and the church create an institution known as the Spanish Inquisition. It follows in the Inquisition, which is a group of people that seeks out to root out heresy and anti-Catholic sentiments. And so in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition very much goes after Jews and Muslims who had recently converted to Christianity. So in 1492, when the Jews and Muslims are kicked out, they basically face an ultimatum. It says either leave or become Christian. And of course, a lot of them convert to Christianity, but continue on with their own rituals and their own beliefs and their own religion. And so this ends up very much upsetting the locals who are themselves Catholics and who want these people to be Catholic as well. They don't want Jews and Muslims living near them. So they use the Inquisition as a way of following these. They're called New Christians or conversos, who are not really being Christian. And you can imagine that this ends up becoming real problematic because neighbors will point out other neighbors and say, oh, he's a converso and he's not being Christian. They get locked up. So you have false accusations being made, and it's a real mess. Eventually, they're able to get powerful enough to where they're able to marry themselves into the family known as marry themselves into the Holy Roman Empire. And I believe it's their grandson who ends up controlling. Well, we eventually see this with Philip V and Charles VIII. They end up controlling Spain, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Holy Roman Empire, and all of Spain's overseas territory. And we'll get to that in a little while, but they end up making Spain really, really powerful. And because of this, we see a rise of Spanish nationalism and pride in their nation, and this concept of Spain as a nation instead of a conglomeration of independent kingdoms. In France, we see this movement towards a strengthening of the monarchy with Charles VII, who's kind of taking over after the end of the 100 Years' War. And Charles VII strengthens the monarchy by implementing two taxes that are universally reviled but very effective for him. And one is the gabelle, and that's a tax on salt. And so anytime salt travels, it is taxed heavily, and that money goes to the monarchy. And the other is the tithe, and that's the land tax. And both of these things are important because that is how the monarchy fills its coffers, right? That is how they make money. But people hate them. And just tuck those in the back of your mind, because when we get to the French Revolution, this is part of the problem. The tax system doesn't work very well. It's broken, and part of it is because of these two taxes, the salt tax and the land tax. But they're useful in that they create a lot of money. And so because the French monarchy gains a lot of money, they're able to spend a lot of money. And so they end up creating the first permanent army in Europe. So before this, when you needed an army, you would tell your nobility, you would raise an army for the minute, you would go to war, and then you would disband them. And so they're not really professional armies. They're just kind of people who pick up the weapons and fight whenever they need to fight. But France creates a permanent professional army, and this allows them to train them better. This allows the army to be well-equipped, well-trained, and thus an effective fighting force in the field. The other thing that Charles VII does is he kind of wrestles power away from the Pope in something known as the Pragmatic Sanction of Bruges. And what this does is that it allows the French king to name the French bishops. So traditionally, the naming of bishops falls under the purview of the Pope. The Pope appoints bishops to various locations. It keeps kind of the Catholic Church separate from the political structure, and thus keeps the Pope's influence alive in various countries. Because remember that these positions, these bishops, oftentimes have a lot of money, have a lot of wealth, and often have connections to the king. And so if the Pope can earn their favor, the Pope can kind of influence the king. But what we see happening is that this allows the French king to name the French bishops. It essentially eliminates the Pope from French politics completely, and it shows the power that the king has over the Pope. It's this continuation of the breakdown in the legitimacy and power of the papacy that we saw first with the thing at Avignon, and then we'll see as it continues into the Reformation. Another king who follows Charles VII is Louis XI. He's known as the Spider King because he's so kind of devious and the way he spins his webs and his traps. But he continues this centralizing effort and really manages to limit the power of the aristocrats and the nobility. He takes power away from them through various kind of tax collecting means and through enforcing laws against them that prevent some of this fur collar crime that we learned about that caused the peasant revolt. And he embraces the Renaissance a lot. He's very much a man of many letters and wants to do a lot of different things. He also helps to improve the French economy by bringing in international kind of businessmen and merchants. And so this also undercuts the nobility and the aristocrats because he's kind of bringing in new wealth to undercut them and to make money that eventually that tax money goes to the king instead of that money going to the wealthy nobility. So that's France. They kind of work towards centralizing an absolute monarchy. So in what we see in Spain and France is this movement towards an absolute monarchy. In England, we have kind of some different things happening. Following the 100 Years' War, there's obviously lots of turmoil because of the debt, the chaos, peasant revolts, all these sorts of things. And what we see is a series of events known as the War of the Roses. It's essentially an English civil war between the houses of Tudor and the House of York. And so eventually the family of York wins this civil war, but in the process they lose kind of a lot of the power of the monarchy, and the nobles have a lot more power. It's very much a constitutional monarchy where Parliament has a lot of the power. But the following three kind of kings, Edward IV, Richard III, and Henry VII, really work to restore the power of the monarchy. And they're able to do this because the biggest kind of upper hand that Parliament has on the monarchy is that in order for taxes to be passed, the kings have to go through Parliament. And if you can avoid raising taxes, you can kind of avoid calling Parliament and needing them. So these three kings avoid wars. They use diplomacy in order to avoid wars and avoid any entanglement, and thus they're able to kind of right the wealth and the economy of England. And so they're able to fill the royal coffers without going to war, without needing to raise new taxes, and they kind of strip the power of the monarchy by doing so. And in lieu of Parliament, they use what are known as royal councils to help them govern and to give them advice. And so in order to, again, undercut Parliament, instead of choosing from the old nobility that would be in the House of Lords, they choose kind of new wealthy merchants to help them govern. So no longer do the nobles have a say in Parliament because Parliament isn't being called, but they no longer have the king's ear because he's using this royal council to help him rule instead of the nobility. And so this kind of really irritates the nobility, and they try and find ways around it. But in order to kind of insulate the monarchy, a judicial court is set up called the Court of the Star Chamber. It's just like a court, but it's called the Star Chamber because they paint stars on the ceiling. I don't know why, but they do. And in this court, kind of legal reviews against the nobility are heard, and this kind of prevents them from making power grabs towards the monarchy or trying to assert their dominance in Parliament against the monarchy. And so the Court of the Star Chamber is used to help insulate the kings from these nobility who are working against them. They also appoint new justices of the peace who are local law enforcement and have, it's like the Hermandades in Spain, kind of this arm of the monarchy going out into the countryside to be the voice and the presence of the king, while at the same time kind of undercutting the nobles' power by being the king's presence out there, so the nobles can't take advantage, can't continue these rapes, these fur collar crimes. It is kind of a way of appeasing the people at the same time as taking power away from the nobility. And so the Tudor family really increases power and loyalty and the Tudor and York family ends up remarrying into each other. They increase power and the power of the monarchy and increase loyalty of the upper middle class instead of the old nobility. So this newly rich people find a seat at the table in this king's council. The newly rich people find jobs as justices of the peace. The newly wealthy people have the ear of the king. The old nobility have parliament, but the king is no longer calling parliament. So their way of gaining power is slipping through their fingers. And so England shifts towards, it is still a constitutional monarchy, but the kings are trying to find ways around that in order to increase their power at the expense of the nobility.